Ben's assistant replaced our photo with one of their own, and I became the laughingstock of the entire wedding. When the uproar started, Ben defended her, saying it was just a joke. I'd already given him 3 chances before, this was the final straw. With a chuckle and a deep breath, I declared, "All right then, no wedding." Ben and I met back in middle school. It's been 13 years now, and after 7 years of dating, he finally proposed. It was a picturesque evening, the kind you only see in movies. Fireworks illuminated the starry sky, and a soft breeze carried the scent of spring flowers. By the creek's edge, Ben knelt down, the glow of the fireworks casting a golden hue on his face. "Spring, can I be your family?" he asked earnestly. Tears streamed down my cheeks. I had waited 7 long years for this moment. It felt surreal, like a dream too perfect to be true. In response, I put my heart into planning the wedding of my dreams. I took 2 weeks off from work to organize every detail meticulously, ensuring it would be a day we would cherish forever. But on the wedding day, everything went sideways. The big screen, meant to play a heartfelt video I had edited over 3 sleepless nights, betrayed me. Instead of our memories, it displayed photos of Ben with his assistant, Grace. There they were, skiing on snowy mountains, surfing the ocean waves, bungee jumping off cliffs, together conquering one adventure after another. The audience buzzed with whispers, and someone finally voiced the question everyone was thinking, "Isn't that woman not the bride?" My heart sank. The collective gaze of curiosity, pity, and mockery turned to me. In my wedding dress, I stood frozen, searching for Ben in the crowd. He was with Grace, looking equally stunned. When our eyes met, he instinctively stepped in front of her, shielding her from view. That small act shattered something deep within me. Ben and I had a history stretching back to the 7th grade. His family's wealth and status should have kept him far from our small-town school. When I asked him later why he transferred, he said it was due to a fight at his previous school. His grandmother, who was his moral anchor, had insisted he stay in her care. That was how fate brought us together. Before Ben's arrival, I had no friends. My name, Spring, was the subject of endless teasing, and my role as the caretaker of my younger brother only added to my isolation. My 7th grade self was desperate for connection, so I made plans with a classmate one Saturday. But fate wasn't kind that day. My mother caught us on the street, dragged me home, and humiliated me in public, blaming my friend for corrupting me. The next day, the incident was the talk of the school, and my classmates avoided me like a bad omen. I was relegated to the corner of the classroom, an invisible presence. Then came Ben, fearless and unapologetic. He sauntered over to my desk, tossed his bag on the table, and announced, "I'm sitting here from now on. Nice to meet you, desk mate." His confidence was infectious, and for the first time, someone treated me like a person worth knowing. As the years passed, we grew closer, forming a bond that felt unshakable. When my parents tried to force me to quit school to save money for my brother's future, Ben stepped in, convincing his father to pay my school fees in exchange for him improving his own grades. It wasn't charity, it was a lifeline. "I'll make sure you keep studying," he promised. His support became my anchor. When I received my acceptance letter to high school, I looked him in the eyes and declared, "No matter what wrong you do in the future, I'll forgive you." At the time, he laughed, brushing off my words. "What nonsense are you talking about? I'd never hurt you." When Ben moved back to the city for high school, he still found ways to stay close to me. He'd visit, call, and even endure teasing from his friends who insisted we were more than just friends. I was naive, shy, and hopelessly in love. When he asked, "What do you think of us?" I didn't understand. But the blush on my cheeks betrayed my feelings. By the time we graduated, we were officially a couple. Ben's college years abroad were difficult for both of us. He flew back whenever he could, his wallet stuffed with plane tickets as evidence of his dedication. My college roommates adored our relationship, calling us the epitome of love. But those golden years dimmed when Grace entered the picture. Grace was hired as Ben's assistant shortly after he returned to the States. The first time I met her was unforgettable. She brought Ben home one night, supporting his tipsy frame. With her doll-like features and charming demeanor, she introduced herself with a sweet, "Hello, Miss Spring." Mr. Ben had a bit too much to drink. Her politeness seemed genuine, but a strange unease settled in my chest. I reached out to help Ben, but he brushed my hand away, murmuring, "Honey," before burying his head in my shoulder. Grace excused herself quickly, but not before asking to exchange contact information. Her sincerity seemed hard to refuse, and I reluctantly agreed. For weeks, Grace texted me about mundane details, Ben's coffee preferences, his dietary restrictions, harmless questions that eased my suspicions. I felt guilty for doubting her and answered her queries earnestly. But on my birthday, an incident occurred that shattered the fragile trust one had built. That evening, Ben rushed out of the house, claiming an emergency at work. Left alone with my melting birthday cake, I felt a pang of worry. When I checked Grace's social media status, my heart sank. She had posted a picture of herself in a hospital bed with a fractured leg. The caption read, "What a disaster. But he's here with me, as stubborn as always." The accompanying photo showed a man's wrist, adorned with a familiar watch, a pair watch Ben and I had bought together. My chest tightened. My calls to Ben went unanswered, and the doubt I'd been suppressing burst forth like a flood. That night marked the first time I questioned the foundation of our relationship. By morning, Ben returned, oblivious to my anguish. When confronted, he downplayed the situation, claiming Grace was a college friend in need. His excuses were laced with half-truths and guilt-ridden smiles. Despite my better judgment, I chose to forgive him. After all, hadn't I promised to overlook his flaws? As the years went on, cracks in our relationship widened. Ben's growing closeness to Grace, combined with his evasive behavior, tested my patience. Yet, I remained steadfast, clinging to the hope that our love would prevail. But love built on promises alone is fragile. Grace's presence at our wedding, her audacity to play a cruel joke, and Ben's instinctive defense of her were the final nails in the coffin. As I walked away from the venue, veil in hand, I felt an unfamiliar sense of liberation. It was the first step toward reclaiming my life, a life without Ben. Life after calling off the wedding felt surreal. The weeks leading up to it had been a whirlwind of planning, endless calls, and late nights spent perfecting every detail. Now, all that effort felt wasted, reduced to a bitter memory. But in the quiet moments alone, I realized the wedding was not the only thing that had fallen apart. Ben and I had been unraveling for a long time, and I had ignored the signs. Ben and I had built something that felt solid, unshakable even. But looking back, cracks had formed much earlier than I'd realized. After he returned to the States for work, things changed. He wasn't the same Ben who had flown back and forth to see me during college, clutching a growing stack of plane tickets. His calls became sporadic, and his messages felt more obligatory than genuine. Then there was Grace. The first time I noticed something strange was on my birthday, months before the wedding fiasco. Ben and I had planned a quiet evening at home. I had baked a small cake, decorated it with the kind of detail I knew Ben appreciated, and waited for him to come home from work. When he finally arrived, his face was clouded with worry. He barely touched the cake and kept checking his phone. "Is everything okay?" I asked gently, trying to break through his distracted demeanor. Ben abruptly stood up, grabbed his jacket, and muttered, "Something urgent came up at the office. I need to go." I was startled. "Now? What happened? Should I come with you?" "No need." He waved me off, not even looking back. "I'll be back soon." I sat there in stunned silence as he left, the door closing with a resounding thud. The cake sat untouched on the table. Hours passed, and I tried not to let my mind wander, but the anxiety gnawed at me. I considered calling him but didn't want to seem clingy. Instead, I opened WhatsApp to see if Grace might know what was going on. That's when I saw her status update, a photo of her in a hospital bed, her leg in a cast, with a caption about how she'd wiped out skiing. The timestamp was exactly when Ben had rushed out. A second photo appeared shortly after, her hand resting on the hospital bed, a man's wrist in view, wearing the same pair watch Ben and I had bought during one of our anniversaries. Her caption read, "He insists on staying, no matter how much I tell him to leave. Stubborn as always." My heart sank. Was Ben there with her? I debated whether to confront her directly but ended up sending her a polite message asking how she was. She replied almost immediately, apologizing for the unfortunate timing and mentioning that Ben had been there for her since she was alone. It was enough to confirm my fears. Ben returned the next morning, looking worn out but calm. When I asked where he had been, he repeated the lie about an office emergency. It wasn't until I confronted him with Grace's social media post that his facade cracked. "She's an old college friend," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, a nervous tic I'd seen countless times. "She helped me a lot back then, and her family's still overseas. She was injured and alone in the hospital." What was I supposed to do? "Tell me," I said quietly. "If you had just told me the truth, I wouldn't have had to find out like this." "I didn't want you to worry," he replied, his voice softening. "I knew you'd overthink it." It was a weak excuse, and he knew it. Still, I chose to let it go. I told myself that it was a one-time incident, that Grace was just a friend, and that Ben's intentions had been good. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. The doubts grew over time, fed by small, seemingly insignificant incidents. Grace continued to message me occasionally, always polite and friendly. She'd ask about Ben's preferences or seek advice on handling certain aspects of his work. I answered her questions without hesitation, trying to push aside the nagging voice in my head that questioned her motives. One day, Ben invited me to one of his company events. Grace was there, of course, her radiant smile and effortless charm drawing attention from everyone in the room. I watched as she mingled with Ben's colleagues, laughing and joking with ease. She was everything I wasn't, confident, outgoing, and unafraid to take up space. When Ben introduced us, she greeted me warmly, as if we were old friends. "Spring, it's so nice to finally meet you in person. Ben talks about you all the time." Her words felt insincere, but I forced a smile and thanked her. Throughout the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was always just a little too close to Ben, her hand brushing his arm as she laughed at his jokes, her gaze lingering on him for a second too long. It was subtle, but I noticed. Later that night, I brought it up with Ben. "Do you think Grace might have feelings for you?" He looked genuinely surprised. "Grace? No way. She's just a good friend. You're imagining things." "Am I?" I pressed. "She seems a little too familiar." Ben sighed, his patience wearing thin. "Spring, you need to trust me. I've never given you a reason not to." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that the man I had loved for so long was telling the truth. So, once again, I let it go. The turning point came a few weeks before the wedding. I had been working late when my boss, Jason, called me into his office. Jason was a reserved man, known for his calm demeanor and meticulous attention to detail. I had never discussed my personal life with him, so I was caught off guard when he brought up Ben. "I happened to see some photos recently," he said, sliding his phone across the desk. "I thought you should know." The photo on the screen showed Ben and Grace, arms wrapped around each other, wearing matching ski outfits. They looked like a couple, happy, carefree, and perfectly in sync. My stomach dropped. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "From a mutual friend," Jason replied. "I knew Ben in college. I didn't realize you two were engaged until recently." He hesitated before continuing. Spring, I'm only telling you this because you deserve to know the truth. Ben and Grace were close in college. I don't know the full story, but it seemed like there was more than just friendship between them. I felt a wave of nausea. The photo, combined with Jason's words, confirmed what I had been trying to deny for months. Ben and Grace had a history, one that he had kept hidden from me. That night, I confronted Ben again. This time, there was no room for excuses. Why didn't you tell me you and Grace were close in college? I demanded. Ben looked startled. What are you talking about? I showed him the photo Jason had shared. His face paled, and for a moment, he was at a loss for words. Then he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. It's not what you think. Yes, we were close, but it was never romantic. She was just a friend. Just a friend? I echoed bitterly. Then why do you keep hiding things from me? Why do I have to find out from other people? I didn't want to upset you, he said weakly. You're reading too much into this. I stared at him, my heart breaking. The man I had trusted with everything, the man I had built my future around, was slipping further and further away from me. And I realized, with a heavy sense of finality, that I could no longer ignore the truth. The foundation of our relationship had crumbled. The trust we had once shared was gone, replaced by lies, half-truths, and broken promises. I had given Ben 3 chances to prove himself, and he had failed every time. The wedding was supposed to be a new beginning, a fresh start for us. But instead, it became the final chapter of our story. As the wedding day approached, I buried myself in the preparations, convincing myself that everything would turn out perfectly. I told myself that this was the beginning of a new chapter for Ben and me, a chance to leave the doubts behind and move forward. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that something wasn't right. The morning of the wedding was a blur of activity. The venue was beautiful, just as I had imagined. Rows of chairs lined the garden, flowers in full bloom framing the aisle where I would walk toward my future. I had poured every ounce of love and effort into planning this day, dreaming of the moment I'd see Ben standing at the altar, waiting for me. But the reality was far from the dream. As I stood backstage, adjusting my veil and trying to calm my nerves, I noticed a commotion among the guests. The air buzzed with whispers, a murmur of unease rippling through the crowd. I couldn't hear what was being said, but the pit in my stomach deepened. When the ceremony began, I waited eagerly for the video montage I had created to play on the big screen. I had spent countless nights editing it, weaving together snapshots of our journey, from our middle school friendship to our college years and everything in between. It was meant to show everyone how far we had come, how much we had endured to reach this moment. But when the screen lit up, my heart stopped. Instead of the video I had painstakingly created, a series of photos flashed across the screen. They were photos of Ben and Grace. Skiing in the mountains. Laughing on the beach. Standing side by side, arms around each other, smiles so genuine that anyone watching would think they were the couple getting married that day. The crowd erupted in whispers. Someone in the back asked loudly, "Isn't that the assistant, not the bride?" The question pierced the air like a dagger, and all eyes turned to me. I froze, unable to move or speak, as the weight of their gazes bore down on me. My hands trembled, clutching the bouquet so tightly that the stems bent under the pressure. I searched the crowd for Ben, desperate for an explanation. He stood near the back, his face a mask of shock and confusion. Grace was next to him, her expression unreadable. When our eyes met, Ben instinctively stepped in front of her, shielding her from view. That single action shattered whatever hope I had left. The ceremony was in chaos. Guests whispered and exchanged glances, their curiosity and pity directed squarely at me. I felt exposed, humiliated, as if the ground beneath me had crumbled and left me teetering on the edge of a cliff. I walked toward Ben, my steps slow and deliberate. My wedding dress felt heavy, suffocating, as if it were weighing me down. When I reached him, I asked, my voice steady but cold, "What's going on?" Ben hesitated, his gaze flickering between me and Grace. She said she wanted to see our wedding. So I invited her. His words were like a slap to the face. You invited her? I asked incredulously. And the photos? Did she bring those too? She thought it would be funny, Ben mumbled, his voice barely audible. A joke, to lighten the mood. I stared at him in disbelief. A joke? My voice rose, trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. This is our wedding, Ben. The most important day of our lives. And you thought this was appropriate? Grace stepped forward then, her eyes glistening with crocodile tears. I'm so sorry, Spring. I didn't mean to upset you. It was just a misunderstanding. Her tone was laced with faux innocence, but the flicker of triumph in her eyes betrayed her. She wasn't sorry. She was smug, confident in her ability to manipulate the situation. And Ben, as always, was blind to it. The weight of everything I had endured, the lies, the betrayal, the broken promises, came crashing down. I realized then that I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't continue to fight for a relationship that had already crumbled, to give my heart to a man who didn't deserve it. I reached up and removed my veil, letting it fall to the ground. You know what, Ben? I said, my voice calm but resolute. You've made this easy for me. Spring, wait, Ben started, his expression panicked. I silenced him with a raised hand. No wedding, Ben. We're done. The crowd gasped, and Grace's eyes widened in shock. For the first time, she seemed genuinely unsettled, her confident facade slipping. But I didn't care. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about me, about reclaiming my dignity and walking away from a relationship that had only caused me pain. I turned to the guests, who were watching with a mixture of shock and curiosity. Thank you all for coming, I said, my voice steady. But there won't be a wedding today. Consider this a lesson in knowing when to walk away. With that, I walked back down the aisle, my steps firm and unyielding. Each stride felt like shedding the weight of years of heartache and betrayal. By the time I reached the exit, I felt lighter, freer, as if I had finally broken free from the chains that had held me back for so long. As I climbed into a taxi, the driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, handing me a pack of tissues. You okay, sweetheart? He asked gently. I smiled through the tears streaming down my face. I'm more than okay. I'm free. That day marked the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter without Ben, without Grace, without the burden of a relationship that no longer served me. It wasn't the fairy tale ending I had once envisioned, but it was real. It was mine. Walking away from the wedding was the hardest, and most liberating, decision of my life. The days that followed felt surreal, like I was floating in a strange limbo. I had left behind not just Ben but also the version of myself that had spent years compromising, forgiving, and waiting for something better. It was time to start over. I moved into a modest apartment across town, leaving the lavish space Ben and I had shared behind. I only took the essentials, clothes, books, and a few sentimental items. The rest, I left for him. Those things belonged to a life that no longer fit me. The first morning in my new home, I sat on the floor with a cup of tea, staring out at the city skyline. It was quiet, almost eerily so, but I found comfort in the silence. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a call, a message, or an explanation. I wasn't holding my breath, hoping for Ben to fix things. I was free to breathe again. Ben, of course, didn't make it easy. He called incessantly, leaving voicemail after voicemail filled with apologies, pleas, and promises to change. At first, I listened to them, my heart aching at the sound of his voice. But with each message, I felt less inclined to respond. The turning point came one evening when he showed up outside my office. I had stayed late, finishing up a report, and as I stepped out into the cool night air, I saw him standing there, holding a massive bouquet of roses. His face lit up when he saw me, as if he thought the flowers alone could erase everything. "Spring," he said, stepping forward. "I messed up. I know I did. But I can't lose you. Please, just, let me explain." I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. "Explain what, Ben? That you lied? That you prioritized grace over me? That you thought humiliating me at our wedding was just a joke?" His face fell. "I didn't mean for any of that to happen. I made mistakes, but I love you. I've always loved you." I shook my head, my voice steady. "Love isn't supposed to hurt like this, Ben. If you truly loved me, you wouldn't have done any of those things." "But I can change," he insisted, desperation creeping into his tone. "I've already blocked grace. I'll do whatever it takes." "Then do it for yourself," I said, turning away. "Because it's too late for us." I left him standing there, clutching the bouquet, as I walked away. For the first time, I felt no pang of regret, no urge to look back. It was over, and I was at peace with that. Life didn't transform overnight. Rebuilding myself was a slow, painful process. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and pushing myself to excel. My boss, Jason, noticed my renewed focus and began entrusting me with more responsibilities. He even offered me a chance to join an overseas assignment, a rare opportunity that could propel my career to new heights. At first, I hesitated. Leaving everything behind felt daunting, even though I had already left so much. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was exactly what I needed, a fresh start in a new place, far from the shadows of my past. I accepted the offer and began preparing for the move. Packing up my life felt bittersweet, but as I sorted through my belongings, I found a sense of closure. Each item I chose to take with me was a step toward building a new future. The day I left, I stood at the airport with a single suitcase, waiting for my flight. My phone buzzed with one final message from Ben. "Spring, please don't leave. I can't imagine my life without you. I'll wait for you, no matter how long it takes." I stared at the screen for a moment before turning off my phone. His words no longer held the power they once did. I wasn't leaving for him, or anyone else. I was leaving for me. As the plane took off, I felt a sense of exhilaration and fear. The city I had called home for so long grew smaller beneath me, fading into the distance. Ahead of me lay a new country, a new job, and a new beginning. Adjusting to life overseas was challenging, but it was also invigorating. The new environment forced me to step out of my comfort zone, to meet new people, and to embrace opportunities one never would have considered before. My colleagues were welcoming, and the work was demanding but fulfilling. I finally felt like I was living for myself, not for anyone else's expectations. One evening, as I was settling into my routine, I received a message from one of my friends back home. Guess what? Ben and Grace had a huge falling out. He's suing her over the money he invested in her studio. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. The two people who had once caused me so much pain were now tearing each other apart. It was poetic justice, in a way, but it no longer mattered to me. They were part of a past I had left behind. As the months turned into years, I continued to grow. I earned a promotion, built lasting friendships, and even adopted a tiny stray kitten that had been abandoned near my apartment. The kitten, with her scruffy fur and defiant spirit, reminded me of myself, a little battered but determined to survive. I named her Sunshine, a reminder that even after the darkest storms, there's always light to be found. One day, as I walked home from work, I passed a storefront window and caught a glimpse of my reflection. The woman staring back at me was confident, strong, and unapologetically herself. For the first time in years, I felt proud of who I was, and excited for the future. 2 years passed, and the life I had built overseas felt like my own. The heartbreak, betrayal, and confusion that once consumed me were now distant memories. I had learned to stand on my own 2 feet, to find joy in the little things, and to embrace the person I was becoming. But the past, no matter how far I tried to run from it, had a way of creeping back in. One quiet afternoon, I received a call from an old friend back home. I hadn't spoken to her in months, but her voice carried a mix of excitement and hesitation. "Spring, I know you're busy, but I thought you should know. Ben's been asking about you." I sighed, the familiar weight of his name settling over me. "Why?" "He's been trying to find ways to reach you. Apparently, he's not doing so well. Ever since you left, he's been drinking a lot, and now he's in the hospital." I was silent for a moment, unsure how to respond. Ben had once been my everything, but now he felt like a stranger, someone from a chapter of my life I had already closed. Still, the news stirred something in me, pity, perhaps, but not the love I once held for him. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. "But I've moved on." And I meant it. A week later, I received another message, this time from Grace. Her name flashing on my screen caught me off guard. I debated whether to open it but ultimately decided to see what she had to say. Her message was short and oddly humble. "I know I hurt you, and I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that Ben never stopped loving you. He's been trying to make things right. I hope you'll forgive him one day." I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Grace's apology, whether genuine or not, didn't matter to me. Forgiveness was a choice I had already made, not for Ben, but for myself. Carrying resentment would only weigh me down, and I had no intention of letting the past define my future. My life overseas continued to flourish. I earned another promotion, moved into a larger apartment, and started exploring hobbies I'd never had time for before. I took up photography, capturing the beauty of the bustling city and its serene outskirts. My tiny kitten, Sunshine, often accompanied me, her playful energy a constant reminder of resilience and joy. Then, one day, an unexpected opportunity arose. My company offered me the chance to return home to lead a major project. It was a role I couldn't refuse, even if it meant facing the city and the memories I had left behind. I packed my belongings once more, feeling a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Sunshine meowed at my side as if sensing the change. "We're going back," I told her, stroking her soft fur. "But this time, it's on my terms." Returning home was surreal. The city felt familiar yet different, like revisiting an old dream. My new position came with its challenges, but I welcomed them with open arms. The team respected me, and I found myself thriving in ways I hadn't imagined. One afternoon, as I was preparing for a meeting, Jason, my former boss and now colleague, stopped by my office. He leaned against the doorframe, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Welcome back," he said with a rare smile, handing me one of the cups. "It's good to see you thriving." "Thanks, Jason," I replied, taking the coffee. "It's good to be back." We chatted briefly, catching up on work and life. Jason had always been reserved, but there was a quiet kindness to him that I had come to appreciate over the years. As he left, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the mentors and friends who had supported me along the way. One evening, as I was walking home, I passed a park where Ben and I had once spent countless hours. The memories surfaced, but they no longer carried the same weight. Instead of pain, I felt a sense of acceptance, a recognition that those moments had shaped me but didn't define me. I paused, taking in the sight of children playing and couples strolling hand in hand. Life went on, and so had mine. Months later, at a company event, I crossed paths with someone unexpected, Jason. He wasn't his usual composed self. Instead, he looked slightly nervous, holding a glass of champagne but barely sipping it. "Spring," he said, approaching me. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Of course." He led me to a quieter corner of the room, where the hum of conversation faded into the background. For a moment, he said nothing, as if searching for the right words. "I've admired you for a long time," he began, his voice steady but sincere. "Not just for your work ethic, but for your strength and resilience. I know what you've been through, and I think you're one of the most remarkable people I've ever met." I blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. "Jason, he held up a hand, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm not asking for an answer or anything. I just wanted you to know how I feel." His words lingered in the air, warm and genuine. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of opening my heart again, not because I needed someone to complete me, but because I was finally whole on my own. As the event continued, I found myself smiling more than I had in a long time. Life had come full circle, and though the journey had been painful, it had also been beautiful. I had rediscovered my worth, built a life I was proud of, and learned to embrace love, not just from others, but for myself. The next morning, as I sipped coffee in my sunlit kitchen, sunshine curled up on my lap, I reflected on how far I had come. The girl who had once clung to a toxic relationship was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her value, her strength, and her ability to create a life filled with joy and purpose. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. Whatever came next, I was ready. After all, spring is a season of new beginnings, and so was I.